During decades, military archives kept this story in total secrecy. No soldier who participated wanted to talk about what really happened that night in the Ardennes forest. But today, you are going to discover why. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel for more daily documentaries. Ready? Now turn up the volume and let's begin. The first reports arrived at dawn. American forces had broken through the German defenses along a 3-mile stretch of the Siegfried Line. This was not unusual in the winter of 1944. What made these reports different, what made German high command initially dismiss them as propaganda, was the description of the attacking forces. Black American soldiers, operating in near-complete darkness, had overwhelmed multiple fortified positions considered impenetrable. Colonel Werner Hoffmann of the Wehrmacht's 276th Volksgrenadier Division initially refused to believe his field commanders. "Schwarze Amerikaner," he reportedly asked during an emergency briefing at 4:33 in the morning. "Are you certain?" The confirmation came minutes later via field telephone. 3 German bunkers had fallen in less than 40 minutes. The initial assessment suggested a specialized commando unit. The truth was far more significant. The 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, a segregated unit of the United States Army, had not been deployed for this specific mission. Originally assigned to a support role 5 miles from the front, they were not supposed to engage in direct combat operations. Their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Warren, had received explicit orders from 7th Army Command: maintain position, provide logistical support, await further instructions. The regiment's previous requests for combat assignments had been repeatedly denied. Warren had complained through official channels, but his protests disappeared into the bureaucratic machinery of a segregated military. The 505th was trained for combat, but relegated to digging latrines and unloading supply trucks. The situation changed on December 7, 1944, when German artillery destroyed a strategic bridge near Aachen. The loss of this crossing point threatened the American advance in the sector. Major General Robert Hardin needed to secure 3 key German bunkers controlling access to an alternative route. The planned assault by elements of the 28th Infantry Division was delayed when their transport vehicles were diverted to evacuate a field hospital under artillery threat. With no other combat units available, Hardin faced a critical decision. Intelligence reports indicated the German positions would be reinforced within 24 hours. The bunkers had to be taken immediately. Desperate circumstances created an unprecedented opportunity. Warren's 505th Regiment was the only combat-ready unit within striking distance. Hardin's adjutant, Major Philip Lancaster, reportedly advised against deploying colored troops for such a critical mission. Lancaster's handwritten note, discovered in 1962 during the reorganization of military archives, stated bluntly, "These men have never seen actual combat. We cannot risk the entire operation on an untested Negro unit." General Hardin, facing the imminent collapse of his northern flank, made the decision regardless. At 2200 hours, Warren received new orders: prepare 3 companies for immediate assault on the German fortifications. What happened next would be deliberately omitted from official battle reports. According to the limited documentation that survived, Warren gathered his company commanders in a partially destroyed church in Roentgen. Captain Isaiah Blackwell, commanding Charlie Company, later described the meeting in a letter to his wife that was intercepted by military censors and only declassified in 1967. "The general needs those bunkers taken by dawn. The white boys couldn't get here in time, so suddenly they remember we exist. The colonel asked if we were ready. Every man in that room stood straighter. We've been ready since we got here." The preparation time was minimal. The men of the 505th had 4 hours to plan an assault on heavily fortified positions defended by veteran German troops. They had no detailed maps of the target area, no aerial reconnaissance photos, no artillery support. What they did have was extensive training that had been largely ignored by the High Command, and a burning determination to prove their worth in combat. At 0100 hours on December 8, 1944, 147 men from the 505th departed their position. They moved silently through dense forest in complete darkness. The temperature was recorded at -7 degrees Celsius. Their approach route took them through a minefield that had been partially mapped by reconnaissance units 3 days earlier. Sergeant William Toussaint, who had worked as a surveyor in Louisiana before the war, memorized the incomplete minefield diagrams and led the first platoon through without a single casualty. The German defenses were arranged in a triangular pattern, with each bunker positioned to provide covering fire for the others. The standard approach would have been a frontal assault supported by heavy weapons. Warren had none of these advantages. Instead, he divided his force into 3 elements and implemented what later military analysts would describe as a ghost tactic: silent infiltration followed by simultaneous strikes from multiple directions. Charlie Company, led by Captain Blackwell, targeted the northernmost bunker. They crawled the final 300 meters, using the noise of the German generators to mask their movement. At exactly 0230, all 3 companies initiated their attacks. What happened inside those bunkers would become the subject of intense speculation and rumor throughout the German 7th Army. Later interrogations of German prisoners revealed a consistent narrative. The defenders were overwhelmed before they could mount an effective resistance. Several described the attackers as shadows and phantoms. One German lieutenant insisted the Americans had used special troops trained in silent killing. The reality was both simpler and more profound. The men of the 505th had spent 17 months training for combat while being denied the opportunity to fight. They had studied night operations extensively, knowing that darkness would partially shield them from the racism that limited their deployment. They had practiced silent movement and close-quarter fighting with an intensity born of frustration. When finally given the chance, they applied this training with devastating effectiveness. By 0315, all 3 German bunkers had been secured. American casualties numbered 11 dead and 17 wounded. Approximately 70 German soldiers were killed or wounded, with 34 taken prisoner. The 505th had achieved its objective well ahead of the expected time frame. Captain Blackwell established radio contact with regimental headquarters at 0322 and reported simply, "Objective secured, awaiting further orders." The response from headquarters was delayed by almost 40 minutes. When it finally came, Warren was instructed to withdraw his men and return to their previous position. The 28th Infantry Division would arrive in the morning to secure and hold the captured bunkers. No mention was to be made of the 505th's involvement in the operation. The official battle report would attribute the successful assault to elements of 2 corps. Warren protested this decision through the proper channels. His formal complaint, submitted on December 9th, stated, "The men of this regiment performed their duty with exceptional courage and skill. They deserve recognition equal to any other American soldiers." This complaint was never acknowledged. Instead, Warren received transfer orders 3 weeks later, reassigning him to a training facility in England. The 505th was returned to supply and logistical duties for the remainder of the campaign. The success of the operation created an uncomfortable situation for certain elements within the American command structure. The performance of the 505th directly contradicted the prevailing narrative about the combat capabilities of black soldiers. Rather than revise this narrative, it proved easier to simply erase their achievement. Colonel Richard Holbrook, who served on General Hardin's staff, later wrote in an unpublished memoir, "There was no malice in the decision, it was simply expedient." Recognizing these men would have forced broader questions about the deployment of Negro combat units, questions the Army wasn't prepared to answer in 1944. The captured German prisoners presented another problem. Their accounts of the battle contradicted the official version, several specifically mentioned being overwhelmed by black American troops. Major Lancaster instructed the interrogation officers to dismiss these statements as confusion or deliberate misinformation. The prisoners were quickly transferred to camps far from the front lines. Their debriefing reports were filed separately from the main battle assessment and remained classified until 1963. What could not be so easily managed was the impact within the German military communication system. For approximately 72 hours, German intelligence officers received multiple reports of Schwarz-Amerikanische Sturmtruppen, Black American shock troops, operating along the Siegfried Line. The designation appears in at least 7 different field dispatches recovered after the war. Several German units reported heightened alert status based on rumors that these specialized troops conducted operations exclusively at night. Within the American forces, knowledge of the 505th's achievement spread through unofficial channels. Black service units heard fragmented accounts from wounded men evacuated to field hospitals. White combat units moving through the area discovered evidence that contradicted the official battle reports. Lieutenant James Kettering of the 28th Infantry Division wrote in his personal diary on December 12th, "Arrived to hold ground supposedly taken by our boys, only to find a colored sergeant and his demolition team still clearing the last bunker. He didn't seem surprised when I told him we were getting credit for his work. Said that's how it always goes. If you're following along so far, help us bring this story to more people. Like the video, comment if you already knew about this case, and subscribe to the channel." Now, we return to the point where everything changed. The aftermath of the December 8th operation followed a pattern that would become familiar throughout the European campaign. Black combat units performed effectively when given the opportunity, only to see their contributions minimized or erased from official records. This systematic reduction of their role had multiple motivations, not all of them driven by simple racism. Military historians have identified institutional inertia, political considerations regarding post-war policies, and concerns about public reaction as contributing factors. The German response to encountering black American combat troops evolved over time. Initial surprise gave way to tactical adjustments. A captured German field manual from February 1945 included a section specifically addressing American Negro combat units. The manual stated, "These specialized troops operate most effectively in low-light conditions. They should be engaged at maximum distance whenever possible." This assessment, while rooted in racial stereotypes rather than tactical reality, nevertheless represented a significant shift in German military thinking. Black American soldiers had become a recognized combat element, even as their own army struggled to acknowledge their contribution. The men of the 505th continued their service through the remainder of the European campaign. They would participate in 3 more combat operations, always under similar circumstances, urgent situations where no other units were available. Each time, their achievements would be documented and then effectively buried in classified reports. Each time, the pattern of deployment, success, and erasure would repeat. The human cost of this institutional failure extended beyond the battlefield. Staff Sergeant Marcus Gaines, who led the assault team on the 3rd bunker, returned to segregated America after the war. His discharge papers indicated no combat experience, despite his having been wounded twice in action. When he applied for a police position in his hometown of Chicago in 1946, The department rejected him for lack of relevant leadership experience. The Army's erasure of his service continued to shape his civilian life. Lieutenant Colonel Warren never commanded a combat unit again. His transfer to England removed him from the operational theatre just as the Battle of the Bulge created desperate need for experienced officers. He spent the remainder of the war training replacement troops who would serve under other commanders. His personnel file, reviewed by military historians in 1968, contained multiple commendations for his training methods, but no mention of the December 8th operation. Warren died in 1959 without seeing his unit's achievements officially recognized. The German bunkers captured by the 505th were eventually incorporated into the American defensive line during the German Ardennes offensive. Their strategic value became apparent when they helped anchor the northern shoulder of the American line during the Battle of the Bulge, a position taken by men who had been deemed unsuitable for combat, played a significant role in blunting the last major German offensive of the war. For decades, the story remained fragmented and largely unknown. Participating soldiers were discouraged from discussing the operation. Official histories omitted any mention of the 505th's role. The few written records were scattered across multiple classification levels and storage facilities. The full account might have remained permanently obscured if not for an unexpected discovery in 1962. Dr. Eleanor Chambers, researching material for a comprehensive history of American logistics during the European campaign, requested access to supply records from December 1944. Through what appears to have been a filing error, she received a portion of Major Lancaster's personal papers, along with the requested documents. These papers included his handwritten notes from the emergency deployment of the 505th, including a candid assessment written the day after the operation. The Negro troops performed beyond all expectations. Their success creates certain difficulties regarding established deployment policies. General Hardin has decided that operational security requires limiting information about the specific units involved. Dr. Chambers recognized the historical significance of this material. Rather than immediately publishing her findings, she began a methodical search for corroborating evidence. Over the next 5 years, she identified and interviewed 27 surviving members of the 505th. She located German prisoners of war who had been captured during the operation. She systematically requested declassification reviews of related military records. The resulting manuscript was submitted to the Army Historical Review Board in 1967. The board's response was not what Dr. Chambers had anticipated. While acknowledging the factual accuracy of her work, they declined to publish it through official channels. Board Chairman Colonel Walter Drummond wrote, "While your scholarship is commendable, publication at this time would necessitate contextualizing decisions made under wartime conditions. This could potentially distract from the Army's ongoing integration efforts by focusing on past policies rather than current progress." Effectively blocked from official publication, Dr. Chambers considered alternative outlets for her research. Before she could proceed, however, she received an unexpected communication from the Department of the Army in early 1968. The recently appointed Secretary of the Army had reviewed her manuscript and authorized a limited declassification of records relating to the December 8th operation. This decision coincided with broader reassessment of the contributions of black service members during World War II. The declassification process revealed additional details that even Dr. Chambers had not uncovered. The most significant came from the personal papers of General Robert Hardin, who died in 1956. His private journal, made available to military historians in 1969, contained a detailed account of the decision to deploy the 505th. "Necessity has forced my hand where principle should have led. These men have been training for combat since their induction, yet we have relegated them to labor duties based on nothing but the color of their skin. Tonight I need soldiers, and I will use the best available troops, regardless of race. If successful, this operation may open a discussion about our deployment policies. If unsuccessful, it will unfortunately reinforce existing prejudices. The journal also revealed that General Hardin had submitted a formal commendation for the 505th, specifically citing their exceptional courage and tactical proficiency during the bunker assault. This commendation was never processed. Instead, Hardin received a confidential directive from Army Ground Forces headquarters advising that recognition of this particular operation would not serve the Army's broader strategic communication objectives. As documents became available, a more complete picture emerged of how German forces perceived the operation. Intercepted German communications from December 9th included an urgent request from field commanders for information about specialized night warfare units within the American order of battle. German intelligence officers conducted multiple prisoner interviews seeking details about the Schwarz commando units. According to one intelligence summary, prisoner interrogation yields contradictory information regarding these troops. American white soldiers claim no knowledge of such units. This suggests a high level of operational security surrounding their deployment. The most revealing German document was a personal letter from Field Marshal Walter Model to his staff on December 14, 1944. Recent reports of Negro combat units operating on our front require careful evaluation. If Americans are now committing these troops to frontline operations, we must consider the implications for our defensive strategy. Our current estimates of American combat strength do not account for these additional formations. We may face a more substantial reserve force than previously calculated. By 1969, sufficient material had been declassified to allow limited public acknowledgement of the 505th's role. A brief mention appeared in the Army's official history of special operations in the European theatre. The citation noted simply that elements of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment successfully conducted a night assault on German fortifications in December 1944. This modest recognition came 25 years after the operation and long after many of the participants had died. For surviving veterans of the 505th, this belated acknowledgement brought mixed emotions. Former Captain Isaiah Blackwell, interviewed for a military history journal in 1969, expressed both satisfaction and lingering frustration. "I'm pleased the record is finally being corrected, but I think about the men who didn't live to see it. We never fought for recognition. We fought to prove we deserved the same opportunities as any other American soldiers. It shouldn't have taken 25 years to acknowledge what we accomplished in one night." The declassified materials revealed that the 505th success had actually generated significant discussion within senior Army leadership in December 1944. Major General Luther Miller, who commanded the adjacent corps, wrote to Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall, suggesting a reconsideration of deployment policies for black combat units based on the operation's success. This communication was flagged for post-war consideration and effectively shelved. The immediate tactical success achieved by the 505th failed to overcome institutional resistance to broader strategic change. For German commanders, the encounter with black American combat troops represented a different kind of challenge. Their racial ideology had prepared them to dismiss these soldiers as inferior. The tactical reality forced a re-evaluation. A German divisional intelligence assessment from January 1945 noted, "American Negro units have demonstrated unexpected effectiveness in specific combat operations. While not typically deployed in standard frontline roles, they appear to be utilized for specialized missions requiring stealth and infiltration capabilities. Defensive preparations should account for this specialized threat." What becomes clear from the assembled evidence is that both American and German military organizations struggled to reconcile their racial preconceptions with operational realities. The 505th's successful assault on the German bunkers created cognitive dissonance on both sides of the front line. The German command had to acknowledge the combat effectiveness of troops they had been conditioned to consider racially inferior. The American command had to reconcile the unit's performance with policies based on assumptions about the limited combat potential of black soldiers. The most significant impact may have been among the men themselves. Private First Class Joseph Wilkinson, who participated in the assault on the second bunker, wrote in a letter to his brother on December 10th, "Something changed out there in the dark. We've always known what we're capable of. Now they know too. The Germans panicked when they realized who was coming through that door, but the real shock wasn't for them. It was for our own command when they heard what we'd done. That's why they're trying to keep it quiet." Some truths are too powerful to acknowledge. By the time the historical record was partially corrected in the late 1960s, American society was engaged in a fundamental reassessment of race relations. The civil rights movement had forced a national conversation about equality and representation. In this context, the story of the 505th acquired significance beyond its immediate military importance. It represented a tangible example of how segregation had compromised military effectiveness while denying equal opportunity to black Americans, even as they served their country in combat. Military historians have subsequently identified multiple operations where black combat units were deployed in similar circumstances. Emergency situations where their capabilities were suddenly valued, only to be forgotten once the crisis passed. This pattern reflected the paradoxical nature of American race relations during World War II, fighting against Nazi racism abroad while maintaining systematic discrimination at home and within the military itself. The December 8th operation remains particularly significant because of the documented German reaction. The Wehrmacht's response, initial disbelief followed by tactical reassessment, provides unique insight into how racial preconceptions influenced military thinking on both sides. The German commander's panic, when confronted with effective black combat troops, represented the collision of ideology with reality, a microcosm of larger contradictions within the conflict. For the men of the 505th, the operation represented both achievement and frustration. They had demonstrated their capabilities under the most challenging conditions, only to have that demonstration deliberately obscured. Staff Sergeant William Toussaint, interviewed for an oral history project in 1971, summarized this contradiction. "We didn't just fight the Germans that night. We fought centuries of people telling us what we couldn't do. We won both battles. Then we watched, while the official report erased half the victory. The historical significance of the 505th's action extends beyond the immediate tactical outcome. Their experience illuminates the complex relationship between race, opportunity, and recognition in American military history. It demonstrates how institutional policies shaped not only the experiences of black soldiers during the war, but also the historical record that followed. The systematic minimization of their contributions represented an extension of the same discriminatory practices that had initially relegated them to support roles. What makes the December 8th operation particularly compelling is the documented panic among German commanders when they realized who had overwhelmed their defenses. Their reaction revealed the vulnerability of racial ideology when confronted with contradictory reality. The German military, steeped in Nazi racial doctrine, found itself forced into a tactical reassessment based on actual combat outcomes rather than preconceived notions of racial capability. By 1969, when much of this information finally became publicly available, the United States military had officially desegregated. Executive Order 9981, issued by President Truman in 1948, had begun the process of integration. The army that had once deliberately obscured the achievements of the 505th was now acknowledging, albeit belatedly, the contributions of its black service members. This institutional evolution mirrored broader social changes, but it came too late for many of the men who had demonstrated their capabilities on the battlefield. The legacy of the 505th's December operation continued to evolve in subsequent decades. Military training academies eventually incorporated the bunker assault as a case study in effective night operations, though often without emphasizing the racial context. Veterans organizations lobbied for more comprehensive recognition, including unit citations and individual commendations for surviving members. These efforts achieved partial success, with a Presidential Unit Citation finally awarded in 1973, nearly 30 years after the operation. For historians, the story of the 505th represents a case study in how military records can be shaped by non-military considerations. The systematic effort to minimize the unit's role reveals how historical documentation can be influenced by social and political factors beyond the battlefield. The fragmentary nature of the surviving evidence demonstrates the challenges of reconstructing marginalized military experiences. Each recovered document, each belated interview, adds another piece to an intentionally scattered puzzle. The most enduring impact may be in how this story forces a reconsideration of other official military histories. If the well-documented achievements of the 505th could be effectively erased for decades, what other contributions by marginalized groups might remain obscured? This question has motivated ongoing efforts to re-examine military records with attention to whose experiences might have been minimized or omitted entirely. For the few surviving veterans of the 505th who lived to see the 21st century, the gradual acknowledgement of their role brought a measure of validation. Former Corporal Henry Daniels, interviewed for a documentary in 2003 at age 81, reflected, "History is written by people with agendas. Sometimes the truth takes a long time to surface. I'm just glad I lived long enough to see our story finally told. A lot of good men didn't. The German bunkers that were the focus of so much courage, achievement, and subsequent controversy no longer exist. They were demolished during post-war reconstruction. No memorial marks the site of the 505th's most significant combat action. The physical evidence has disappeared, leaving only the documentary record, itself nearly erased, to preserve this chapter of American military history. What remains is a compelling narrative of capability demonstrated against overwhelming odds, both tactical and institutional. The men of the 505th overcame not only entrenched German defenses, but also the entrenched prejudices of their own military establishment. Their achievement on December 8, 1944, deserves recognition not just as a successful military operation, but as a moment when soldiers transcended the limitations imposed by their society and demonstrated the hollow nature of racial restrictions. The panic among German commanders when confronted with effective black combat troops represents a powerful historical irony. An army fighting for a regime built on racial supremacy found its assumptions challenged on the battlefield. The defensive adjustments made in response to the 505th's success represent a reluctant acknowledgement of reality over ideology. In this small but significant way, the men who stormed those bunkers struck a blow against the very foundations of Nazi thought. For the American military, the success of the 505th presented a different kind of challenge to institutional thinking. Their performance contradicted the rationale for segregated service and limited deployment of black combat units. Rather than revise policies based on this evidence, the institution initially chose to obscure the evidence itself. This decision reflected the deeper social context of American race relations, where maintaining established racial hierarchies often took precedence over military effectiveness or individual achievement. The story of the 505th reminds us that history is not simply what happened, but what is recorded, preserved, and acknowledged. The operation itself took place in a matter of hours. The struggle for recognition continued for decades. Both aspects, the combat achievement and the long quest for acknowledgement, are essential parts of the historical narrative. Together, they illuminate not just what happened on a single night in December 1944, but how American society has grappled with questions of race, recognition, and opportunity over more than half a century. The men who stormed those German bunkers fought with the hope that their performance would open doors for those who followed. The institutional response initially denied that opportunity, but the truth proved more durable than official policy. Their story, nearly erased from history, now stands as testimony to both the capabilities of those who served and the flawed systems they sought to change through their service. As we look back on this chapter of American military history, we're reminded that combat effectiveness recognizes no racial boundaries, even when military policy did. The German commanders who panicked when black troops stormed their bunkers discovered this truth through direct experience. The American command structure took far longer to acknowledge the same reality. The men of the 505th knew it all along. Did you enjoy this story? Your support helps us continue producing new documentaries. A like, a comment, or a share makes all the difference. Check out more historical cases on our channel. And if you're not subscribed yet, join our community. I'll see you in the next episode.